Now I'd like to welcome Eleanor Brown. Thank you.
There we go. Hi, everyone. Wait, now there are two microphones. I'm confused.
Yeah, sorry, you can use either one.
I can use either one. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, so I used to teach 7th grade, which means I am very loud. And no matter how loud you are, you will never be louder than 120 13-year-olds. It also means that if your cell phone rings, I will answer it. I used to do that and they would be my students' parents. And I'm like, don't you know they're in class right now? Why are you calling them? So thank you all so much for coming tonight. I'm super excited to be here, and I'm super excited to see so many people supporting your local library. I am a huge library fan. Those of you who've read The Weird Sisters know a little bit about my book and library obsession. I live in Douglas County in Highlands Ranch, and I'm on the board of the Douglas County Library System. So I'm a big advocate for libraries, and as you all have been walking in, a number of you have had books checked out, and I've kind of been creeping, like, what are you reading? You've got a couple of good ones. You got Joan Didion and The Salt Line. The Salt Line's really good. If you need any book recommendations, just let me know. So my name is Eleanor Brown. I'm the author of 2 novels, The Weird Sisters and The Light of Paris, and the editor of an anthology called A Paris All Your Own. I'm here tonight to talk about The Light of Paris, but I'm going to talk about the other ones kind of on the way there. So my first novel, The Weird Sisters, came out in 2011. I had always wanted to be a writer. I grew up in a family of readers. Nothing I loved more than stories. Nothing I valued more than stories. In my family, sort of the last question everybody asks before you walk out the door is, do you have anything to read? That is the most important thing, because if you don't, you're going to be stuck in line somewhere and wishing you had something to read. And I don't know about you guys, but there have been those low moments where I have been stuck reading the return policy on the back of a receipt. Have you been there? All right, you're my people. So I always wanted to be a writer, and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. But a novel was the thing that eluded me. That was really, really hard for me. So I wrote a bunch of really terrible books. And I say this to people, and they always think that I'm being falsely modest. But really, they were terrible. And it is for your protection that I do not let them out into the world. But I did finally write a book that I was proud of and I would be willing to let other people read, and that was The Weird Sisters. And you can ask me a little bit more about the publication story of that if you're interested later. But The Weird Sisters came out, and before it came out, I was sure that 2 people were going to read it. My mother and my editor's mother. And my editor's mother's name is Eleanor. So she had like an extra reason to read it. Well, to my surprise, The Weird Sisters did very well. It became almost a New York Times bestseller. So, almost an instant New York Times bestseller. It was a #1 international bestseller. It was on the USA Today bestseller list. And that was wonderful and also terrifying. Because while I knew that it meant that people were enjoying my story, it also meant that every time I would go to a book event like this and talk to people about The Weird Sisters, the same question would always come up. Can you guess what it is? What's next, right? And I know that it sounds like I'm weeping from the deck of my yacht when I say it's so hard to follow up a New York Times best-selling book. But it is hard, right? Because I knew that question meant, I knew it was a compliment. I knew it meant I enjoyed the time we spent together. When can we do it again? But it also felt like a lot of pressure because I was writing and I was writing and I was writing and I wasn't writing anything good. I basically have to write about 5 bad books for every good one. So I'm writing and I'm writing and I'm writing, have a terrible time with it, and then I'm visiting my parents in Washington, D.C. And we were talking about Jazz Age Paris, Paris in the 1920s, like you do, right? This is just the conversations that people have. My father says to me, you know, your grandmother lived in Paris in the 1920s. And I was like, okay, time out, 1 second. The Paris? The 1920s? Like F. Scott Fitzgerald Paris, Hemingway Paris, Gertrude Stein Paris, Picasso Paris, that Paris? And he said, yes. And then my mother says, and we have all of the letters that she wrote home when she was there. I know. So, after I picked myself up off the floor, I went home. I had a big box. My family is not known for tidiness, but somehow, somewhere along the way, someone had put each of these letters, you know those like plastic sleeves, sheet protectors? Someone had put them all in there, binders. I go home and carry the box onto the plane because I'm not trusting it, to check baggage. And I went home and I read them, and I thought, there is a story here. So the story of the Light of Paris, there are two storylines. Madeline, who's a woman who's trapped in an unhappy marriage, and she's inspired by the journals her grandmother kept while living in 1920s Paris to change her life. So there's two storylines. There's Margie in 1924, who escapes her disapproving and conservative family and spends this delicious summer in Paris, writing and chatting in cafes with artists and having a romance with a French artist. And then there's her granddaughter, Madeline, in 1999, who's locked in just an unhappy situation. She's locked in a terrible marriage. Her husband threatens divorce. She goes into hiding at her mother's house, but her mother is not super supportive, and she finds Margie's journals, and these really kind of change her life. So I'll tell you my grandmother's story, because that was kind of the scaffolding for Margie's story, and you can ask me later too why 1924 and why 1999, because those years are important. So here's my grandmother's story. My grandmother was raised in a wealthy Washington family. She had super directed parents. My great-grandfather was very, very successful. He was like Secretary of Commerce at some point, owner of a bank, part owner of, I guess it was the Senators at that point, owner of the Senators, the baseball team is what I'm talking about. But they were also Quaker, so they were very forward-thinking. So my grandmother went to college. She was born in 1900. She went to college. She went to Wellesley and graduated. And then she went for a year and taught at what sounds a whole lot like a reform school, right? There's that Quaker social justice bit. And then she went on what was supposed to be her grand tour of Europe, right? The grand tour, like where you go over to Europe and you come back and you're a better person and you have smoother skin and you're very elegant, right? So she went there to that. And they were supposed to go 3 places. They were supposed to go to England, France, and Italy, and then they were supposed to come home. So they went to England. She went with a friend of hers. They had a great time. They go to France. My grandmother gets to Paris, and she decides, I'm staying. So she found herself a job, and she found herself a place to live, and she wrote to her parents, and she told them, and her parents were absolutely thrilled to hear this.
Yeah.
Just kidding! They were supportive, but they were not that supportive. Because you have to remember, this is 1923, right? This is, no matter how forward-thinking you are, this is a big deal. They didn't care so much that she had to get married, but she had to do something with her life. And it's really funny to read their letters, and I can read a bit of them later if you like. Because you know how when you're listening to half of a phone conversation, you can kind of guess what's going on the other half, right? So we only have her letters, but you can kind of figure out what her parents are saying to her, which is basically, get your act together and come home. So she got a job at the American Library in Paris, which I stole for Margie, and she lived at the American Girls Club in Paris, which I also stole for Margie, and she just sucked the marrow out of that city. She had the best time. She was there in 1923 and 1924, which, if you are going to go to Paris, is the time. If you can arrange it, that would be the time to go. And people always ask me, what season is it best to visit Paris in? And I'm like, 1924. That is the season to visit it in. And she really had just an amazing time. So she was there for about a year, and then she got very, very sick. She had had the Spanish flu and the epidemic in 1918, and she had kind of never been fully well since then. And like I said, she was having a really good time in Paris. She's going out dancing until 4 o'clock in the morning, and she sends, there's one letter where she sends she sent a picture of herself, and she says something to her parents like, oh, it's a terrible picture. I look like the back end of a night at the bar. And I'm reading it, I'm like, it probably was the back end of a night at the bar. So anyway, she got very, very sick. So she went to recover in the south of France, like you do. And then she came home. So I'm reading her letters, and all these questions are coming up. So I did not know my grandmother well. My grandmother was 44 when my mother was born. So she was in her 70s when I was born. She developed Alzheimer's soon after, so sort of by the time I was cogent, the person she had been was already gone. But even if I had known her, I wouldn't have known this her, right? I wouldn't have known this 23-year-old her. But the person in those letters and the person that I hear my mother talk about are not the same person. So one of the questions I had was, what happened, right? Like, what happened between the person you were in Paris and the parent you were to my mother? Because I think my grandmother was a very unhappy person. And how did that affect the person that my mother became? And then how did that affect the person that I am? So one of the things that The Light of Paris is really concerned with as a story is how choices we make echo through generations and how family patterns get set, for better or for worse. Mostly for worse because it's a novel and you have to have problems in it, but a little bit for better too. So I took all those questions and I took my grandmother's story and I put them all together, and that's what became The Light of Paris. And for a very long time, well, writers have working titles for their books often, and it's usually something like that damn book. But for a long time, I called this the never book, because it was a whole bunch of things that I swore I would never do. I swore I would never have parallel narratives, right, like more than one storyline, because it would be, whenever I would read a book with multiple storylines, there would always be one that I fell in love with a little bit more. Did you ever find that? And then you're like waiting to get through just to get to the next one. I remember very clearly reading Mona Simpson's wonderful book, Anywhere But Here, when I was in high school. And it's a mother and a teenage daughter. And I remember so clearly skipping through the mother parts, being like, oh, this is so boring. Let's get back to the story. So I didn't want to write that. So that was reason number one. It was a never book. I also said I was never going to write a historical book. 1924, and believe it or not, 1999, turns out that's historical. That was interesting doing research for that. And I also said that I was never going to write anything based on diaries or letters. Right? You know what they say, never say never. But this book just would not let me go. And like The Weird Sisters, if you've read The Weird Sisters, it's about family patterns. It's about people who lose their way and then find it again, because that is very comforting to me as someone who is always seeming to lose her way. And it's about building the life you want. It's also a lot about creativity. So Margie, in 1924, is a writer, and her granddaughter Madeline is a painter. And both of them really wrestle with living a creative life. But I don't, despite the fact that both of them are artists of a kind, I don't think of it so much specifically as art. I think about it as creativity. Have any of you read Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Big Magic? A couple of you? All right. Those of you who have not, that's required reading. Jana, I don't know if the library has it, but you're going to need to buy multiple copies.
Yes.
All right. The way Liz, it's called Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. The way she defines creativity, or living a creative life, is she says, it's living a life that is governed more by curiosity than by fear. I feel like that's such a lovely description of creativity, right? Because that's just about imagination and asking questions and not following the path that you're always supposed to follow. So, I mentioned that 1924 and 1999 are important. One of the reasons is that women's lives are dramatically different between 1924 and 1999, right? There are reasons that we remember those times and those decades. My grandmother has this great, well, it's not great, it's heartbreaking, quote in one of her letters home, where she says to her father, sort of trying to convince him that she's going to grow up, I've decided that when I come home, I'm either going to take typewriting and shorthand and become a secretary, or get married. Now, both of those are completely honorable things to do, But the fact that it was an either-or proposition, even from a family like hers, was really heartbreaking to me. So this is also a book that's very much concerned with the way that women's lives changed over time. It's about shame and failure and success, but it's also about joy and finding your happiness. And when I talk about this, I talk a lot about Margie in 1924, but this story actually belongs to Madeline. It's really her who's kind of changing. Because Madeline isn't unhappy so much because she married a jerk, though she did marry a jerk, or because her mother's hard on her, but her mother is very hard on her. But Madeline is living a life that is crafted to abide by other people's rules. And just spoiler alert, that's not a good way to live your life. She's a people pleaser. She's always trying to meet other people's expectations. And if you're constantly trying to live a life that doesn't belong to you, you're going to end up unhappy. So I did do research for this book. Everybody always wants to know about that. I did. I did go to Paris. We were there for, I think, not quite 2 months. And I can talk a little bit about that trip and that research. I'll talk about it right now. So I was determined to echo my grandmother's experience in as exact a way as I could. So I took a ship from New York to England, which is less fun than it sounds. Has anybody done that transatlantic journey? You have? The North Atlantic is cold. Did you notice that? And a little windy. So we'd be going and walking laps around the deck when you're out there in the middle of the North Atlantic, and like the wind on one side, you're like walking into the wind, and on the other side, you're being blown by the wind. It was lovely. We went on Cunard, which is very nice. I got to buy all these fancy clothes, and when my accountant was like, "Why is there a $300 charge to Macy's?" And I was like, "Research. I needed an evening gown." And then we took the ferry from Dover to Calais, which nobody does anymore because now you can just take the Eurostar. And then we took the train from Calais to Paris. So here's a little travel tip for you. If you can do something in 10 hours or 10 days, do it in 10 hours. But I'm glad I had the experience because it was really interesting. It really opened my mind to how differently my grandmother would have thought of time. Like, we are all, everything must happen right away, right? They didn't have any choice, right? There really wasn't an option to get there any faster, so that was how you did it, and you made the most of it. And I did get to use that. I remember my agent at some point being like, "You should cut this chapter on the ship." And I was like, "Listen, I was on that ship for a week. That chapter is staying." So we rented an apartment in Paris, and I made a list of all the places that my grandmother had mentioned in her letters, and I got up every day and I would try to go to those places, and sometimes that was super successful. So I mentioned the American Girls Club where my grandmother lived. It is now owned by Columbia University and is like dormitories and offices for study abroad programs. So it's still there, and it was summer, so I could go, well, I don't know if I could go in, but I went in, and then just kind of wandered around, and I will tell you that place has not been altered since my grandmother was there in 1924, but in a wonderful way. But then there's a passage in the book set at a restaurant called Rosalie's, which was a real restaurant, very famous among the expats. It was, well, I can talk more about that in a minute, but you go there and it's basically a 7-Eleven. Like, it's no longer this charming little home rule restaurant. So in this story, though, Paris is more of a symbol than it is of anything else, because when we think of Paris, we think of sort of the person that we want to be. Like, you don't picture yourself in Paris, like, shoveling the kitty litter and paying the mortgage and going grocery shopping, right? You picture yourself walking along the Seine, and perhaps you have, like, an elegantly tied scarf, or you're sitting in a cafe and you're writing poetry, right? You picture your best self in Paris. And so that's really what Paris does here. We think about ourselves in Paris as the way we wish we could be, right? The way we wish we could be if we didn't have to feed our children and pay our bills, and those things are non-optional. I don't know if you've tried not feeding your children, but it doesn't work out well. So in this book, Madeline's life is really changed by her grandmother's story. And my life was really changed by my grandmother's story. I feel like we're changed by stories and we're rescued by them in so many ways. One of, I think, the most valuable experiences to me, and this is true of nonfiction or fiction, is that what they call the shock of recognition. Looking at something being like, I feel that way too. And that was the interesting thing about the Weird Sisters, is that when I wrote that, I thought I was the only one, right? I thought I was the only one who was pretending to be an adult. I thought everybody else actually felt like a grown-up inside. And then I went out, and people would come up to me and they'd be like, I don't feel like a grown-up either, We're all just pretending, don't tell anyone. And that was a really wonderful feeling, to feel like we're not alone. And that's what stories let us do. You are not the only person with this problem or this question. You are not the only person who has wrestled with this. Probably people have wrestled with something similar through the sands of time. So the lesson with the Weird Sisters was that I wrote that story because I needed to figure things out, and I needed to ask those questions, and it turned out other people needed to have those questions asked too. And that was really what The Light of Paris did for me as well. People ask if my stories are true all the time, and I always say that they're emotionally true, but they're not factually true. So the feelings in there and the questions that the characters wrestle with are always things that I have wrestled with and that I've wondered about, and that I hope you do too, because that's something that we all share, and that we are really saved by those stories. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have about Paris, about The Light of Paris. The one thing I didn't mention is that after I wrote The Light of Paris, I edited an anthology about Paris. I gathered together 18 best-selling women writers, and I kind of asked them, who had all written books about Paris, and I asked them for their personal Paris stories. So Paula McLean, who wrote The Paris Wife, is in there. MJ Rose, who writes sort of paranormal historicals, is in there. She has a great love story in there. J. Courtney Sullivan, why am I blanking? Oh, Cara Black, who writes the Amy LeDuc mystery series. Every mystery is set in a different place in Paris. She was super fun because she's wandering around Paris going, where would you hide a body? And I have to tell you, I never had that thought when I was in Paris. No matter how bad a day I was having, I had some bad days in Paris. So anyway, that's the other book as well. So you can ask questions about writing, about Paris, about my grandmother. And I did warn you I was a 7th grade teacher, so if you don't ask a question, I will call on you.
I'll save the crowd here.
Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
What did you teach in 7th grade?
What did I teach in 7th grade? I taught English and drama. And I started out teaching both, and then I realized there was quite enough drama in middle school. They needed no assistance. Although I will tell you that one of my former drama students is Zoe Kravitz, who is now quite the movie star, and I take all credit for that. It has nothing to do with the fact that her parents are mega stars. It's all my 7th grade drama class. Yes?
So how did you get your agent into the publisher? How did that journey happen?
Okay, so the publication story. So I had been writing all along, and I had a number of smaller pieces published, short stories, columns in alternative news weeklies, things like that. I entered a bunch of contests, and so then when I had the Weird Sisters, I went out and I submitted it to literary agents. And there are people who will tell you, like, oh, I was rejected by 20 agents. It was so terrible. I was rejected by 99. But you know what my policy was? I just sent out letters. I sent out query letters. I was like, they're like buses and men. Another one will come along. And I finally did find an agent. The Weird Sisters is a story of 3 sisters, and my agent is the youngest of 3 sisters, as am I. And so she and I worked on it together for a while, and then she sent it out to publishers. And people will tell you, they'll be like, oh, I was rejected by 3 publishers. I don't even know how many I was rejected by, but it took 2 years. And then my editor, Amy Einhorn, who is most famous for publishing a little book called The Help, she picked up my book and we edited it some more, and then it was finally published. So from the time I sat down to write to the time that it was published was about 7 years. So I always say if you're looking for a speedy path to fame and fortune, I recommend reality television, because book publishing isn't it. But my experience is also kind of an outlier. I have another friend who, she submitted her first novel, found an agent right away, and then the agent sent it out on a Friday, and by Monday morning it went to auction, which means there were multiple publishers interested. Now, she is the nicest person you will ever meet, but anytime I hear her tell that story, I just want to punch her in the face. So I'm one end of the spectrum, she's another end of the spectrum. Most people fall in the middle, but that's the publication story. Yes?
Since you used your mother's letters for the book, how did your mother react to your book?
I used my mother's letters for the book, so how did my mother react to the book? She loved it. I did steal Margie's, I stole some of my grandmother's story for Margie, but Margie is not my grandmother, if that makes sense. But nonetheless, I think that my mother was very excited. I know she's very excited by that connection. Parents are so funny. They're so ridiculously proud of me. And one thing I learned from publishing a book is that people are gonna think it's about them, even when it's not. So my first book, The Weird Sisters, the father in it is actually based on a graduate school professor of mine, and that's who I think of when I think of it. But my father thinks it's him. And I know this because right after The Weird Sisters came out, we were together in the car, and he turned to me, and my father's a trained opera singer, so he has like this voice, and he turns to me and he says, "I have decided who I want to play me in the movie." And I was like, well, it's not you, Dad, but okay. So anyway, I think my mother really enjoyed that connection, and you know, my grandmother was of an era, as I mentioned, where her choices were limited. And I think that she would have been very happy not to be a mother. I think she would have been very happy not to be married. I think she would have been really happy just sort of traveling and being independent and single, but that was not okay at the time. And she got married relatively late. She was almost 30 when she got married, which at the time, like, you might as well have been dead. And then my mother, too, I think if she had been raised in a different family at a different time, I think my mom probably would have been a doctor or a veterinarian, but she didn't have those choices yet. So I think that a lot of what touches her this story is it's like an alternate view of what her life could have been like, you know what I mean? In that way. So she's very happy. The book is dedicated to my parents and to my grandparents, especially my grandmothers. And they love that, too. Yes?
You mentioned that 1999 is an important year. Why is that important, except that that's the year I got married?
1999 was?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I chose it because it was the year you got married.
Tell me that.
No, I knew you. I wrote this book for you. No, I'm kidding. So 1924 and 1999, let me talk about both because they kind of link together. So 1924, is like the apex of the jazz age in Paris. Everybody is there at that point. My grandmother people often ask me if my grandmother talks about famous people in her letters. She doesn't. There are some Easter eggs in the light of Paris, little surprises. I don't mention anybody by name, but if you're familiar with that era, you'll pick up on them. And what was I talking about? 1999, right, so 1924. So 1924 is huge. I mean, think about what has just happened. We remember the 20s for a reason. World War I has just happened. It has decimated an entire generation of young men. There's something like, I don't know, some percentage of the women in Europe who were married, who were able to get married, who were of that generation. It's something minuscule. It's like 50 or 60%, which is just really, really tiny at the time. So everybody's whole world has changed. Birth control has become more accessible, which of course revolutionizes women's lives and the control they have over their bodies. So 1924 is really, really important. And then I had a math problem, which is that people can only be having babies so old. So if I wanted this to be her granddaughter, I was like, all right, how far can I push this? And 1999 was kind of the furthest I could push it. But I also thought about, so 1924 is like this year of seismic shifts. And 1999 is the same way. I don't know if you guys remember how we all felt in 99. We really thought the whole world was going to change overnight. It did change. It took 17 years, but it didn't happen overnight. And I worked on the Y2K project, by the way, so you can thank me for the fact that your toaster did not explode the day after. So anyway, it was like this idea of outward shifts in the world, and then at a time when I had characters who were undergoing inward shifts, and I wanted the outside world and the inside world of the characters to echo that. So that was why I took it. I don't know if I didn't tell you that. I don't know if you'd pick up on it, but it makes me happy to think about it. Other questions? Yeah.
When you get drunk, do you get funnier or serious?
When I'm drunk, I get funnier or serious. I don't drink. But I will tell you, I mostly get sleepy, which is basically why I don't drink. You know what I ever read from my grandmother's letters?
Yes.
Okay. That's usually one of the first questions I get. So, when I read these letters, I told her I didn't know my grandmother very well, but as soon as I read them, I was like, oh, honey, you are amazing. Like, she is 23 when she writes these, and she is so 23. Like, she knows everything, and she has no fear in telling it, and she spends a lot of time trying to convince her parents that she's mature enough to be on this great adventure. So, like, she'll send them these lengthy financial accountings, and then at the end of the letter, there will also be a long list of things that she wants her mother to send to her so that she doesn't have to buy them when she's abroad. So here's one of these places when I think she's just so amazing. I know Dad is right theoretically when he wants me to start in some definite line of work and stick to it and get ahead in it, but I honestly have no desire to settle down at anything yet, even though I will be 23 in 9 days. Please try to understand. There is so much I want to try before I settle down to any one thing, marriage or work. And then there's this line, right? Remember, she's trying to convince them of how grown up she is. I seem to have gotten more or less of a perspective on myself and to realize how spoiled and contrary I have always been. Of course, it was your fault for spoiling me in the first place. I mentioned the Rosalie's, the restaurant piece. By the way, there's a very little bohemian restaurant over here in the Quartier Latin called Chez Rosalie. It is dim, dirty, full of atmosphere, and very small. Only room for about 15 to sit down at a time. Different, more or less famous artists have painted pictures on the wall, most informal. And what is still more interesting is that Rosalie herself was a great flame of whistlers and was the model for the portrait of his mother. I should say she was about 55 or 60 years old now, and quite large, Italian, and most temperamental. If she doesn't like you, she won't let you come again. And she becomes very angry if you leave anything on your plate. Did you guys ever watch Seinfeld? She reminds me of the soup nonsense, which I think I do. It is so dirty that I don't go there very often, and besides, as one of the boys says, it is dangerously cheap. So my grandmother, like I said, she had a very, very good time, and the letters she writes are to her parents, right? So I know that she sort of elides over some experiences, but I can also tell you there's a lot that she tells them. But she says this: I have carefully refrained from giving you any detailed account of my Paris parties, as they sound so fearfully wild when you put them on paper. And they really aren't so terribly bad. You see, standards are so utterly different over here that what would ruin your reputation at home means nothing at all to anybody. Everybody stays up all night, and everybody goes to the Ritz and the New York bar, and Zellie's and Pigaul's, where the prostitutes hang out, are absolutely okay if you have your own crowd. And then she does have, well, she's on dates all the time. Like, she will schedule them literally back to back on the same night. But she did have a relationship with a French artist named Jean Hanou, and she writes about him a lot. This was the inspiration for the love story in the book, but it's not the same guy. She says, I've met a good many of John Bancroft's friends, and especially like Jean Hanou, a young French artist, who traveled around Italy with him this fall. Jean is both clever and charming and has a most attractive studio. She spends a lot of time in his studio. I am just saying. I feel like a fish out of water in the middle of art discussions, but John says I'd be all right if I'd only talk a little more often. However, I maintain that a discreet silence is safer. He is thoroughly fascinating. He doesn't speak any English, so he's very good for my French. And besides, I like the way he kisses my hand. So you can see why, when I read those letters, I was like, I have to tell this story. This is amazing. Yes?
I think your grandmother was a writer.
I think my grandmother would have loved to be a writer, and that's part of the reason I made Margie a writer. She was an avid reader. Another thing that I did was I tried to dig up all the books that she mentioned to her own letters, in her letters to her parents. And it's really, well, it's disheartening as an author, but it's really interesting as a reader to see how much books have changed, and like the books that she was reading that were really popular you have never heard of, and for good reason. Like they're boring as sin. But anyway, she had some things published in her high school literary magazine. She graduated from high school in 1918, so there's these very like sentimental war poems, and I think she would have liked that, but that just wasn't an option. It just was not an option for her at the time. And so it's one of the reasons that I'm very, very grateful to get to do what I do, because it is an option for me, and I'm very, very grateful for that. Maybe time for one more question? Yeah.
So when she left this trip
Uh-huh.
and decided she was going to stay there, did she know anyone?
My grandmother?
Yeah.
No, she knew nobody in Paris.
Unbelievable.
Now, at the time, I mean, this was sort of like expat life was really big at the time. It was
Oh, sure.
incredibly cheap to live there. And there was this huge, people just sort of searching and wanting to be part of the art scene. So she does run into a lot of people she meets. But my grandmother was one of those people who, you always have the friend who like gets invited to the crazy parties, or like you go out to dinner with them and then you go home and you talk to them the next day and you're like, what did you do last night? And they're like, well, I was walking down the street and George Clooney came along with the tiger and was like, hey, do you want to go on this roller coaster? But that was my grandmother. She was just one of these people. She's like, well, I got invited to a private tour of the Rodin Museum, and tomorrow I'm going to, have lobster and caviar at Premier's, and then I'm going for drinks at the Ritz afterwards. She has no money. I don't know how she is affording all this. Well, it's being bought for her. So anyway, so she just kind of had that spirit. And it's interesting, so in my essay, In a Paris All Your Own, my essay is called Failing at Paris. And it's about going in with the idea of my grandmother's experience in Paris, and then having my experience in Paris, and how sort of disappointing and frustrating it was. But I really have so much admiration for her, because she really did have nothing. She'd never been abroad before. But she had all that gorgeous youthful stupidity, right? That surety that you have that everything is going to be okay, right? And I was a little closer to 40 and a little less sure that everything was going to be okay. I'll tell you the worst experience. I was talking to somebody before about whether Parisians are rude or not. I did not have that experience at all. I only had met rude Parisians in one place, and that was the Apple store. And I think that has a lot more to do with the Apple store than it does with Paris, because I don't like going to it in English. So here's another travel trip tip for you. Don't break your iPhone when you're in Paris, because you'll have to go to the Apple store, but you'll have to do it in French. Very stressful. Anyway, so no, she just had that wonderful adventuresome spirit, and that's one of the things that Madeline learns from in the Light of Paris. I think there was one more question over here. Are you asking me out for drinks? I don't drink.
Yes. Let's go. Did your grandmama have lifelong health effects from the Spanish flu?
That's a super good question. Did my grandmother have lifelong health effects from the flu? You know what? I don't know the answer to that question. She lived well into her 80s, and like many people with Alzheimer's, well, she died of pneumonia. So maybe that was it. The Spanish flu coming back for you. No, but I mean, she lived a healthy life. My grandfather was in the foreign service, so they lived all over the world. So she did get to sort of travel and be independent in that way. So I don't mean to make her sound like a sad story, but it was really fun to take her story and give it to Margie and think, well, what if things had been a little bit different? Wait, are you waving me to shut up?
question.
Oh, you're gonna ask me a question? Hang on a minute. Jana has a question.
So you've been talking a lot about how women in the past have had difficulty pursuing creative roles and interests. How do you manage that in this time? I know you probably have a lot more. There's more going for you in this society, but I'm sure you still have stressors. And how do you balance your creative life with your other, duties?
So how do I manage my creative life? How do I balance my creative life with my other duties, or how do we all do that? Well, we have dishwashers, which helps. Well, I have to say I've inherited a lot of my grandmother's silver, and it's like watching Downton Abbey and being like, they had to have servants. Nobody has that much time in the day. Like, my silver just tarnishes, sorry, Grandma. I don't have time to do that. I think that you always have to think of yourself as having a bigger yes, something that you want to say yes to. What I think people run into problems with creative pursuits is that they don't recognize that saying yes to a creative pursuit means they're saying no to something else. We want to do everything. And I think it's especially hard on women because we're trained to sort of be people pleasers and not say no to other people. I'm working on this. I was just talking about this with dinner with my friend Tiffany, saying no to things and doing the things that we want to do. So I do it first. I say this is my priority and therefore I'm doing it first. I write in the morning. I say no to travel opportunities sometimes. I say no to friends sometimes because I've decided to privilege my creativity. And that's really sort of like the tough love part of me. I work with Lighthouse Writers Workshop in Denver. I'm a mentor there, and if you were my mentees, I would love you through this much more. But the short answer is that if you're gonna say yes to your creativity, you're gonna have to figure out what to say no to. But Liz Gilbert's Big Magic is a great book to read to reinforce that. Thank you. All right, here, then last question. Promise.
It's dumb, but what happens to...
There is no
I
dumb
know,
question.
I know.
7th grade teacher has to say there's no dumb question.
Our book group met for dinner before we came here because we just read it, and we wanted to know what happened to Evelyn. No, we don't care about Evelyn.
So Evelyn is for those of you who have not read it, Evelyn is a minor character and she's deeply unpleasant. And it's funny because I talk to a lot of book clubs, and with every book, like, there are certain questions that people always ask, and I never anticipated it, but I would say the most common question I get about The Light of Paris. I read a 300-page book about Margie and Madeline, and people are like, what about that, Evelyn? I think Evelyn, as sadly is the case for many unpleasant people, goes on and has a perfectly fine life. I think she probably steamrollers over people for the rest of her life. So for those of you who haven't read it, that's a little spoiler for Evelyn. But if you want to, in your mind, you can picture her like getting, I don't know, plates of spaghetti dumped all over her, punched in the face, whatever would make you feel happy. Thank you all so much for coming. I do have copies of all of my books back there. I'm happy to sign. I also have bookmarks. I'm about to run out of Weird Sisters bookmarks, which I've been lugging around with me since 2011. So now's your moment if you want one. Or if you just want to come say hi, you're more than welcome to. Thank you all so much for coming.